Hello everyone, it is me, Pui. I am here again with a very different kind of video. On with me today is a very special guest. I've got the user Dej, better known as Frogslicer, very well known, perhaps infamous player in the Edison format circuit right now. And today we're going to be talking about uh, whatever you want to call them. We're going to be calling them probably disgusting for most of the time. Any decks with, alternate win conditions, alternate axes of attacks, just decks that just aren't playing the way that you conventionally expect to. Most of these trading card games have to do with, battling, playing, going tit for tat. And there are certain strategies that exist in Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh, probably some Pokemon, probably some in just about any trading card game that just completely turn everything on their head. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Frogslicer. Frogslicer, how about you tell the people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Frogslicer. I have a video that I make over and over again on my channel, which is just talking about my crazy degenerate deck. And I do play other degenerate decks, and I think that's why I'm here today, so we can talk about all the silly, disgusting stuff. I think you and I both have an affinity for it, right?
Was that a pun?
Yeah.
God. All right, I'm looking forward to this. For those of you who don't know, Frogslicer is the pioneer behind Gotham's Frogs. So if you know the Edison format at all, this is a very long-winded combo deck that usually goes through its deck using combination of Swap Frog, Substitute, and then eventually tries to set up some strange loop of Exodius the what is it? Exodius the Ultimate Forbidden One, or
Yeah, Ultimate Forbidden Lord, yeah.
Exodius the
Yeah, I
Ultimate
mean,
Forbidden Lord and Imperial Iron Wall.
the goal is to touch your poison draw frogs like 30 times.
Yeah,
And once you do that, then you just waste everyone's time even more.
yeah. If you haven't seen his channel, I definitely recommend it. He's got very comprehensive talks on that deck, but he also does a lot of other fun stuff. Recently, he made this like Last Warrior Forbidden Lance lockdown thing. I'm really looking forward to looking into more. And he also did this Nurse Burn thing that really touched my heart in a special place. If any player is going to get me into Edison format, it's probably going to be this guy. I'm sorry, Pro Storm, Dragon Turbo is pretty cool, but these decks are just so sweet. So today we have a couple of big essential questions about these unfair, disgusting decks that we wanted to talk about, and we're just going to go through them one on one. We got a little bit of a structure, but for the most part, it's just going to be a chat between two alt-win enthusiasts. So our big first question, and one that I think is really going to guide the discussion, is how are we going to define disgusting, unfair, degenerate, any of these terms you want to use? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I thought about this a little bit, and I think there's a few key things. I think how competitive something is, because once something's competitive, it just kind of becomes considered combo. And combo is an established part of a lot of games and formats. And I think if your format is balanced, it should have, control decks, combo decks, and aggro decks. If all combo decks are considered degenerate, then I think you have a bad definition.
Yeah, that is a very important point. I think a lot about what makes something degenerate is defined by other people. And I think that those ideas of disgusting and degeneracy get thrown around a little too much. When
Yeah,
really, if the designers didn't want these combos to exist, for the most part, some of them were very clearly intentionally baked into the design. And if they didn't want them to exist, then the cards necessary for them wouldn't exist. Combo definitely does belong somewhere in most trading card metas, and it really helps off balance things a lot.
100%. Yeah, that's a really good segue into what I want to say next, which is like a really good example is Lightsworn. You can have an opening hand, and a lot of people say Lightsworn, sometimes you just open the nuts and you just win. So like if you have a hand that can go first turn double JD under a cold wave, it's crazy stuff. There's crazy stuff you can do turn one. And you can look at those hands and say, wow, this is a very disgusting opening hand. And I think the people who are attracted to this alt win kind of stuff, they want to see hands like that every time. Where a typical Lightsworn player would look at a normal hand and be like, okay, this is a good hand. There's a lot of things I can do. Someone like us, we'd be like, oh, well, that hand doesn't do anything. Like, I'd be playing a different deck, maybe.
Yeah, I
So I
agree.
guess the tipping point, the tipping point is something like the binary 0 to 1. Like, we look at these hands that are, insane in either like an Exodia Turbo deck or a Lightsworn deck, and we see both players will see that as good, but the hands that don't get you that really cool hand, a degenerate deck would see as like unplayably bad, where a normal deck would see as just a decent playable hand.
I think that was a really interesting point, that any deck can have like can make disgusting plays and have a disgusting opener. I'm of the take, the more I've played any games that I've competed in, I've played Magic in multiple formats. I've played now Yu-Gi-Oh in two formats. Played a little bit of Modern. I wouldn't have much of a handle on uh, what's going on there as much. I've also played Super Smash Brothers, so I have that experience as well. And I'd say any deck or any strategy of any kind that is going to be top tier has to have a little bit of that disgusting factor. It has to have hands where you look at them and you go, I'm just going to win this now. Unless something very, very specific happens from my opponent's field. This hand's just going to romp over. In GOAT format, we obviously have Chaos Turbo and Warrior. Warrior can have these hands where you just get taken down to one card. They have a Blade Knight. You're not doing anything. The Duodon does shoot knock hands. Everyone's had to deal with one of those. And then they start setting Solemns. Obviously, Chaos Turbo can draw a crazy amount of cards. I'm honestly surprised that Lightsworn is considered like a fair and normal deck in Edison because it really reminds me of Magic's Dredge deck and also like the Hollow One decks and any of these like mill decks that really take advantage of the graveyard. I would often immediately consider them disgusting because they play on some sort of alternate axis in a way that can attack directly, but if you don't stop it, it will really, really zone in and kind of take you out.
Yeah, I'm glad you said axis because I was thinking of the word like domain or realm or something. That's basically the same thing, or like a vector, where it's just like there's this thing that is this axis that is in the game, and if you don't touch it in any way, like in Yu-Gi-Oh, there's a lot of graveyard recursion, and there's not that much of that in Magic. And we got different snapshot of Magic's history where there's a lot of graveyard touching, but the reason why that's considered like disgusting or unfair in Magic is because normally you have to spend so much resources just to interact with your graveyard, and that deck Dredge, and I guess Hollow One does it as well to an extent, where you just get to do stuff for free, like you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh. So all these fair decks. So like yeah, maybe Lightsworn feels more fair because you're summoning an 1800 beater, but in reality, yeah, you're just dredging. It's the exact same thing.
I think it's interesting that you started talking comparatively to games there, because for starters, obviously, like there's a big thing about the Axis, the big idea that generally I've heard if you can trade one resource for another very easily, that's a very quick route to degeneracy as an idea or to a unfair deck. And I think it's really interesting to compare Magic to Yu-Gi-Oh because the things that happen in Yu-Gi-Oh, especially in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, like the more Yu-Gi-Oh goes on, the more it's doing what it does mechanically, the more it resembles what Magic is doing that is disgusting. Because Magic has that inherent mana system, and so when you're playing as you're supposed to, you're using that mana and as a resource in order to make your moves. Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh, everything is just a matter of paying costs to do things, and then the costs can trigger their own effects. And that kind of stuff would get really out of hand, except they just started designing things to block those sorts of interactions as it went. So really, there's a understandable reason why a lot of the whole Yugi Boomer thing really dislike modern Yu-Gi-Oh because the basic mechanics of that game and the basic mechanics of what makes cards good these days really resembles the sorts of strategies that would be considered disgusting in the past because you can trade resources one for another so easily in a way that would be absolutely unacceptable in most other trading card games.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and that's why I've gotten a lot of the same comment with my Gotham's Frogs deck, which is just like this is a modern Yu-Gi-Oh deck, and it really is similar. I mean, it doesn't have the same consistency. Those decks they have like 90% consistency. Mine's like 50% or something, but it's the same level of like you're ignoring your social cue, and I'm just gonna take my turn for 15 minutes, and we're just gonna play this game, and you can wait until your turn starts, and you kind of get that ignoring of resources in modern Yu-Gi-Oh that yeah, like just simply doesn't really exist in Magic. Like everything, the cool interactions you get in all versions of Yu-Gi-Oh are just like conditions being met. Oh, this is a light and a warrior, or this is a light and a light sworn name or something. But in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, I don't know much about it, but I just know that I'm sure one card touches a lot of different conditions for a lot of different cards, and that's why we're seeing like 45 and 60 card decks and stuff like that.
I did want to touch you. You started talking about what other players have to say about you and your deck, and yours also started talking about the consistency. So that brings me to two thoughts. The first one is our second question, which is, why do you think players dislike disgusting decks?
Yeah, so the first question you asked, I gave you the opposite answer. I'm going to do that again. The reason why people do like disgusting decks is because they, at least in my opinion, I think it's like a lack of knowledge or a lack of faith in yourself. And you say, well, I know how this works. I can practice this by myself. The other people who do not like disgusting decks, I think they have a deck or they have an idea of how the game should be played. And it's this expression of competition, like, oh, well, I'm learning. I think I can get out of any situation. So the people who play degenerate decks like Chain Burn, they're practicing by themselves for who knows 1,000 hours or something, and then they just have their perfect little synergy. And you didn't practice against Chamber at all because why would you? They didn't practice against you. So this idea that you're touching on something that they can't touch on just bothers people, I think.
I want to add another dimension to that, which is, you're implying that sometimes these people even practice in the first place, which like there's some disgusting like chain burn where
That's a good point. That's
there's
a good
there's
point.
skill to appreciate there, and there's really something to it that's more than meets the eye. You have to understand how to use your opponent's cards in your chains if you want to save stuff, and that sort of thing, so you can play out the turns. You're definitely interacting. It's just not in a way that people like. There's also decks like Sneak a Show and Legacy, which is just play spell that makes very big thing and go smash, and now you die. And when you look at a card like that and an interaction like that, you start to see that sometimes players don't have confidence in themselves, and so they pick up a deck like that because it can win a game without as much skill. And then you start to
Yeah.
see this weird dip where people decide they start to see like you know the randomness in that sort of deck, and they're not very happy with it. And then it kind of comes back up to the players who know the odds and put in the 1,000 hours or so, and start to understand it. So you have a really strange U curve. I feel like it's very rare to see a mid-level player playing a disgusting deck really as a committed option. And then on the same note, there's a lot of players I feel is a U curve of disliking these decks where new players don't know how to handle it. The middle level players do know how to handle it, so they feel it's fine. And then you have at the top, the advanced players choose not to handle it. They just are like, I'm not going to
Oh,
play
sure.
this matchup. And they have a way of how this game should be played in their head. And you flipped it on their head, possibly at a high level at the table. Because if you get enough people in a row who aren't expecting that's going to happen, like, I can't believe I lost to this. Because they packed their deck for certain matchups and they didn't pack the deck for you.
And that's exactly what I'm trying to say. So that's a perfect. I really like that U curve, and it's funny because yeah, a lot of people choose to be obstinate and say I'm going to boycott this action or something, and it's only the people who have the highest percentage win rate. When people who so like for me, I didn't play Yu-Gi-Oh forever. I just started back up like 6 months ago, and it was easy for me to say, well, I know Chain Burn, so I'm going to play Chain Burn. And then I was lucky enough to make a deck I really like that I think is pretty competitive, and that's all I've done. And then the big appeal is I can play these decks and beat people who deserve to beat me. I can make it a coin toss simulator against people who have, 70, 80, 90% win rate against everyone. That's super appealing to someone who isn't well practiced, like you were saying, like someone who doesn't put in the thousand hours. Oh, this guy topped a Chain Burn. Chain Burn must be viable. I will play Chain Burn. And then you play it poorly and lose. No big deal. But if you
This
do
deck
practice by yourself,
sucks. This was never good.
exactly. And that's why we don't see them is because very few people stick to it. Because you're right, when you get to that middle part of the bell curve, that's when you yourself stop adopting it. And I think very few people ride the curve all the way, and you have to have a very specific idea in mind of what it is you like about the games you're playing to stick to it.
That's a really big point. A couple of things. I mean, for starters, I also was someone who like I'd say I'm kind of on the first half of the curve where I was just like, I'm new to this format. I don't know what's going on. I know that this game that I'm playing, because I'm mostly playing goats, gets really complicated, has really high interactions, and that there are people who have been at this for like, you know, we're almost hitting 2 decades
Jeez.
now that I don't have on them. But I know that this thing can win for free, and I like that. And I ended up starting out with Reasoning Gate, moving on to Empty Jar, and finding Panda Burn finally. And I think it was only when I started really committing to Panda Burn that I started to have an appreciation of the interplay that can come when a player has experience. I think the player where I really felt this the most was Pro Storm, funny enough, who's mainly known as an Edison player, but he did dabble in goats while he was with us. He's not dead. He's just on a hiatus. Um, but I had this moment where I was like you didn't beat me because I drew bad. You didn't beat me because you drew good. You beat me because you understand this matchup in a way that I don't understand this matchup. And it made me have to push myself and play harder. And now I understand that matchup a little bit. And then people clap right back. People like ProStorm, it's always exciting to play against. I'm still a little salty about how FLC 22 went with the 1 in 4 MST, but he's really someone who I respect talking to and playing with because every time we discuss, he ends up hitting me with like 3 paragraphs of all of his decision making. I was like, wow, you were thinking really, really hard about this.
He's like god tier for this game. It's ridiculous. And also, it's not a 1 in 4 with him for MST. It's basically 100%, like maybe 90%.
Oh no, he
He'll hit
rolled
what
a
he
die.
wants.
He rolled a die and clicked a card.
Yeah, that's still Pro Storm doing it. So I don't know.
There was no chance I had to win. He just always had the right die roll. On that second point about why people want to play this game, there's this whole thing about, and I think it's a lot of where the animosity comes from. Returning to our essential question here, that people who play these decks aren't looking to interact with you. They're looking to win without actually having to meaningfully understand the interactions. For newer players, they don't have to understand the interactions. For players, on your caliber and the higher levels, it's more about I've chosen to not interact in these ways, and I have an awareness of how you can interact, and often again how you've chosen not to interact because that card doesn't help in most matchups. But people get really frustrated by that. Whereas I think I can say this for you, I can say this for myself certainly, that a big reason why I play this game is the identity formation. I really like that people call me the Burn Queen. I personally think I'm a bit of a fraud. I'll say that out loud. But I think it's really nice that I got to put the time in the deck. I found some success with it. And now people come and talk to me about it. And I've really, grown that whole Burn World community and such, and really gotten to make a name for it. Other people have picked it up too. And it's really nice to be the person who people go to for that and who is known for that. And certainly, I think you were in that same position with the Gotham's Frogs now.
Yeah, I mean, we're both advocates of this. Like, we don't feel any shame with playing this weird stuff, and I think that doesn't make us bad. I think it's cool. Like, people just need to get over it. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, these decks are capable of sacking people and just playing a non-game, but any of these decks are capable of playing a non-game. And also, provably, there are players who really put in the time to think about how to play them best, and there are people who really put in the time about how to play against them best. Personally, I am always thinking about how you beat these certain matchups. I never leave the
Yeah.
house without having some plan for, in Goats at least, Reasoning Gate or Empty Jar. When I was playing Modern Magic, I would always have some sort of graveyard hate and some sort of artifact hate because I had no time whatsoever for those decks taking me out of the blue.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's this incentive, like what you were saying with Goat, that there's these people who have like 20 years of practice in this stuff, and that's a relatively or almost completely solved meta is Goat right now. It's so like
It's really
long
close.
lived stuff. Yeah, really close. So the idea is you're never going to compete with those people, like you were saying earlier. And with Edison, we have something similar, which is no one's really there. Some people are kind of there. Some people never stop playing Yu-Gi-Oh and they're really well practiced. But the available deck space is just huge. So if you want to be one of those top players who plays the game fairly, then you're going to be studying, I don't know, 100 different decks and practicing the matchups or something. But if you play a non-interactive deck, you just know your thing and say, well, I need to watch out for these kinds of cards, like this vector, Like for God's Frogs, I don't care about D Prison, but D Prison is in a lot of competitive decks. So hey, here's a trap that if you draw it, it will do nothing against me.
Yeah, and on the note of that, if you draw it, we have to talk about something very essential here,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is specifically to TCGs. You build a deck, and then you see a random amount of that deck. That is a very core piece of any of these games and formats mechanics that really, really work into a lot of the stuff. Because for starters, right, that 15 years thing is true, and there's a lot of experience to go into it, and some of these players are really great and really sharp and will probably beat you most of the time, like aside. But at the end of the day, the game is a game of luck and skill, not just pure skill. If it was a game of pure
exactly.
skill, that's what you wanted. Go play chess. Go play something where there's no randomness. This is a game that really just has a lot of luck and skill because you have to build a board, but the pieces you get to do so are random. And that means, for starters, that there's randomness in what you can prepare for. And there's also randomness on whether or not you even draw that preparation. Because there are times, right, where you can't side out the D prison, say. And you did side in another thing, but you sided out an even worse card. So you now have, I don't know, DD Crow. Is DD Crow useful against you? D Fisher?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I have 3 D Fisher in my deck now, and I draw D Prison instead still. That feels
right,
really bad,
exactly.
and it's inherent to happen, but it's also how those skill ceilings are equalized, and it makes for really good entertainment and really good stories.
And that's what's cool about Yu-Gi-Oh is the ban list, right? You have all these limited power cards, and it's really big in Goat. Uh, but the idea of, well, I can do this, but it doesn't play around brain control, right? It's like, well, sometimes you just have to do that. Play around what you can. You use your hand, and people there's like this really weird like skill dynamic that I still haven't really gotten a good grasp on, which is how much do you play around the things you're afraid of? Like sometimes you just have to say they probably don't have it. And if you lose if they do.
That is one of the biggest skills to learn in any of these formats with these power cards. It's one I also struggle with a whole ton, especially as a Panda player. There's so much like, are they going to heavy storm me? And there's something I learned from Shane of all
Mhm.
people, which is just sometimes you look at the board, you say, I'm dead to heavy storm regardless. And you set those 5 cards. You don't just set 2, you
You
set them
do.
all. Because heavy storm is just it. So sometimes it's playing around it, sometimes it's just accepting it, and it's really, really hard. But it really
Yeah.
allows that skill ceiling and skill floor to merge in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. I have a hot take regarding GOAT format, which is that without Panda Burn, we'd already be in like a tier 0 Chaos Turbo format. I think that is the only deck that actually gives turbo trouble, even post sighting. And I think every other deck is just sort of trying to, but can't always. Because I think that deck's pretty degenerate in how consistently it can build a large amount of advantage that you can't interact with because it's turn 1 and your turn 0.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know much about Go format, so I can't really comment, but I do know that Panda Burn is really, really spicy. I really like it. And I'm glad that it's like actually a part of the meta.
Oh, yes. I'm loving watching all these people get their tops. No one's won yet, even, so you can't even call it like a tier 1 deck, but it's just, it has enough of a place and it's disrupting the meta enough that I think it's keeping it interesting. Um, which is bringing me to my next question. And I had it framed as, are these decks good or bad for trading card games? But I'd like to just rephrase it as, why are these decks good for trading card games? What do they do?
Well, it seems like we already touched it for your example with Panda Burn, but I do think that the examples what I brought to the table is I updated Chain Burn. I didn't invent Chain Burn, but I updated it for Edison. Fun fact: Edison is probably the worst time in all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history to play Chain Burn. Ojama Trio's at 1. I think it's the only time it was ever at 1, and that's just ridiculous. And then after Edison, they get like Card D and like Pot of Duality and stuff, and Swift Scarecrow. So they get a lot of cool stuff that you'll still see in modern Chain Burn decks like today. So it's like this weird no man's land that I decided to touch. Chain Burn isn't perfect. Like a lot of people, especially at the time I was playing it, people were actually citing Jinzo, right? So they weren't citing Jinzo out of fear of Chain Burn. They had it in their side deck because it was good against a lot of decks, and it happened to like completely stomp me. So it's just like this idea that these cards that are good side deck options against everyone, just good ideas, are also kind of they're hitting the same axis of these alternate win decks. So like everyone has DD Crow in their deck. That hurts me with my combo deck with Gotham's Frogs. I would argue that it doesn't really mean much. Like when you look at the math of it, unless you're siding in the full 3 crows, I'm just going to ignore them. The 1 crow isn't that big a deal. So if everyone says, oh, I'm going to side in 1 or 2 crows, then yeah, I'm in a good spot. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is you are influencing people's side deck in such a way that you're shuffling the meta, which is good. Like you want churning in the meta. If you get a stagnant tier 0 meta, nobody wants to play that game. Nobody wants to play that format. And that's why so many games die, period. So the fact that like there's these legacy Yu-Gi-Oh formats that keep on shuffling, like Edison is this crazy example where we have a giant tournament every 2 months and the top 8 looks completely different every time.
Every
Like that's
time.
just out of this
It's
world.
astounding.
Anything that kind of fosters the variety like that is just good for the format. So I think like these degen decks, especially in Edison, like they only help.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I especially think it's really good to understand that in reality, in isolation, it may feel like you're kind of helpless because when we think about metas and we think about our strategies, we always have to think in aggregate. So when you play that one game against that one deck, it sticks out as like, oh, this was awful. This was so unfair. I couldn't do anything. But you've had tons of games like that against any deck. I don't think any of the decks, at least in Goat or Edison, really cross that line. I think also looking at modern Magic, there was a long time where a lot of those decks didn't really cross that line. For me, at least, I think the lines are consistent FTKs. I personally am very happy with the strange library technicality going on. For those of you who don't know, Convulsion of Nature right now has a little exploit on Dueling
Yeah.
Book, so we don't let people use it, which means library doesn't work. And to me, library as a deck is so unpleasant because really there's no interacting with it, even when it feels fun. It's just either they've won and you've done nothing, or they lost and you've done nothing. There's a very
Yeah.
finite ways of interacting with library that I think really limits it, even versus empty jar, where there's a lot of points of interaction that you can interplay with and they can interplay with.
Neko Main King.
Neko Main King. Funny enough, Neko Main King isn't even the best one because we found this ruling that basically like mind control is an inherent answer to Neko Main King, and then on top of that, there's prohibition and stuff. So like
Oh,
there's interaction for the interaction. It's interesting to me.
yeah. I love that.
I think that at the same time, though, right, once the answers, even if they exist, become like mainstay, must use, dedicated every time, only for that matchup for every deck, that's when things get a little excessive. So, for example, if Light Swords were like the only graveyard deck and they were crazy super powerful, like they could mill 10, like they had that grass, right? If Light Swords had that
Yeah.
grass and everyone needed to play Graveyard Hate at 3, or maybe even in the main, because it had such a mainstay in the format that it just was worth playing in the main. That's something worth looking at. And then my last like limit is if it starts playing with mechanics that exist outside of the game, and start pushing things that aren't supposed to be pushed within the game. For example, there's certain burn players who in timed rounds, because of the way that
Oh,
tie
yeah.
rules work, you just lower their life points at the last second of a round timer and you win automatically. So you start pushing round timer rules. There is a card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Called Self-Destruct Button. I made a deck
Yeah.
that I showed on Jinzo and Tonic's channel a little while back called Self-Destructor, and the idea of that deck was that it was a last turn deck, but it used Self-Destruct Button to just go and tie the game over and over again until it got an
Try again.
ATK. And that deck
Yeah.
isn't consistent, but if it was consistent, I consider it to be a massive problem and one worthy of just
Yeah.
being illegalized in a format. But I think beyond that, most of the strategies that exist right now, with very, very few exceptions, are just here to diversify things and require you to think differently and use different tools and be more aware of different things.
Yeah, there's two things I want to touch on based on what you were just saying. Like one is I'm my favorite deck is Final Countdown. And it is not because of that degenerate thing you can do where you go to time and just kind of steal wins. But with Final Countdown, it's basically a perfectly valid strategy, and you have to do it. If there's like, I don't know, 7 minutes left in the round, you side out your final countdowns and you side in 3 golden ladybugs. It doesn't matter which part of Yu-Gi-Oh's history you're at because you're just going to stall for turns and gain 500 or 1,000 life every single turn, and you're just going to win that way. I don't like that about the deck. What I do like about the deck is I make this state where you have to figure it out. I'm making this puzzle box and you have to break out of it. That's why I like that deck.
I love the puzzle. I absolutely love the puzzle. I love
Yeah.
getting matched against a disgusting deck.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that's another thing I really wanted to touch on is we have this insane advantage. Like if I switch to Blackwings, which for anyone who is paying close attention, here's my secret tech. I think Blackwings are good against every unfair deck in Edison format. So if I wanted to switch to Blackwings, I know these unfair decks really, really, really well. So I will have an extreme edge against someone who says, "Well, I'm never practicing it against them." So that's cool. And I guess you can kind of do the same thing with fairies in Edison. But yeah, one of the other things I wanted to touch on was this level of consistency, right? And we talked about it already with modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And everyone has a vibe of what exactly modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is. It changes every 3 months, but it's still the exact same thing.
Hmm.
But there was a deck in Magic's history that I don't know too much about. I know a little bit about. It's eggs, and you know eggs. Yeah.
I know.
So the guy who invented eggs, he was like a chess grandmaster or something. He was some like brilliant mind at chess. And he also played Magic, and he took it like out of nowhere to the first tournament. I think this was like 2008 or something. And it's this combo deck that you can consider like Splinter Twin a combo deck in Magic, right? You get these two pieces, you put them together, and then hey, I make infinite tokens and win that way.
Yeah, but this is
But
not.
eggs, it's exact opposite, even though they're both combo. This is every time you do something, your win rate slightly increases by like 1 or 2 percentage points. So you start off, and yeah, the first time you play your big bomb, I can't remember what cards are called, but once you play your first one, that's a point where they can counter. And if they don't, then your win rate went from like 50 to like 75, and then you do your loop again. Now it went from 75 to like 95, and you have to do it, and never hits 100%. You have to play perfectly through every little step of the way. And they banned that deck because of how much time it took. It sucks that such an interesting, cool little idea like ended up being considered degenerate just because it was a non-perfect like mistake basically. Like a lot of two-card combos in Magic are like these mistakes. Like, oh, this card we didn't think it was going to interact with this other card this way. Like Channel Fireball, right? The first combo, right? Is that not the first combo?
Channel Fireball is like the famous first combo. Wasn't intentional. Trade one resource for another. Quintessential. Unforgettable.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
It's like, yeah. So there's all these really neat little things that just come up, and it's just I don't know. I like it, and I guess it's the same reason people get mad.
It's interesting. It's also extra interesting that eggs, in modern at least, eventually ended up evolving into Quirk Clan's Ironworks combo. And that
Yeah.
actually ended up being, I'd say, like very excessively degenerate. That was a deck that was actively warping the metagame, actively existed. The only thing that was limiting that deck was people's willingness to play it. Um, because that was a
Yeah,
deck
which
where
is
if you
funny.
did even okay, your chance of winning was huge. It was so consistent. It had such a crazy
Yeah.
inevitability. It wasn't as hard to pilot as people thought. I had the pleasure of playing it a couple of times, but I just remember my opponents were so frustrated. Absolutely so frustrated. Um,
Salt mining. You
yeah,
got to do it.
you have to salt mine. I have to be honest. I'll put a couple up right now, a little bit right here. We'll show some things, but it's so fun. Like just learn to figure it out and how to do it. Sometimes we're gonna sack you. You want to get mad about a sack, I understand, but there's things you could have done. You missed it there, you missed it there, you missed it there. Always, you can learn and you can grow and you can figure out the matchups better. But speaking of these salty players, certainly there's some that have said some things that are uh, honestly quite unsavory. And I wanted to get to one last question before we departed, which is how do we make these matches with or against the disgusting deck better for everyone?
So my approach is my solution, which is just make everything open information. If people are talking about chain burn and openly disrespecting it, and then they lose to it, that's their fault. Like, so if you're not prepared for something degenerate and you lose to it, that's because you weren't prepared. Like these things that if they were oppressive, they would be dominating. They're not, you know? So awareness. So like, yeah, I made some little combo deck and I made 30 videos about it. I like that. Like normally people want to safeguard information like that, but I think, I like the format more and I think the format can handle it. So just talking about these things and, being disrespectful is fine, but if you lose to it, it's because, you didn't know enough, I guess. That's kind of how I feel. So it just needs to be on people's radar, just another one of the decks you prepare for, one of those other vectors you have to think about.
Absolutely. I am one that I've never really enjoyed like smashing a worse player. Certainly not with a disgusting deck, right? I never want to be fighting the people on the, lower end of that curve before the
Yeah.
queue. Because it's just like there's no pleasure in that, right? I'm trying to play a real game here. I've gotten into the habit of sort of explaining some misplays once in a while if I really can tell people are in over their head. And then when it comes to people that
Mm.
have the experience and got mad anyway, I don't have any time for you. You could have learned. You know how to figure out a matchup. Just figure out the damn matchup. I have to admit, though, there was a long time with a lot of players that were better than me that I was concealing information with Pandaburn. And looking back, I was really doing a disservice to everyone there because that deck really started taking off and evolving, I'd say, just a little bit after I started opening things up a little better to everyone. I think the information drove people to innovate more to combat against it, and I think that the combating against it really drove the Pandaburn players more to really evolve the deck and turn it into what it is now. We got the beatdown sides. We've got people not trying chain energy. A new video on that coming soon. Um,
Cool, cool.
and I think it really took a little bit of hardship for the deck to evolve, honestly, past I know, what I even know about it, which I'm really happy with. So I agree absolutely that the information should be open. Disgusting players don't try to conceal stuff because they're going to find out eventually. For people playing against these decks, please remember that the player is not the deck. They have their motivations for playing it. They're not actually trying to make you have an unfun time. They're trying to make themselves have a fun time. They're not trying to do that at your expense. They'd like you to have fun too. And they don't deserve your harsh words.
Yeah, the hater's gonna hate. What are you gonna
Haters gonna hate, what you gonna do?
do?
So that's all the time I have for now. Make sure that you check out Frogslicer's channel. I'll put a link in the description. Frogslicer, is anyone else you want to shout out?
Yeah, so I helped invent a fake format of Magic called PDH. It's Pauper Commander. And my friends have been streaming Pauper Commander content for like 8 years now, like 2 times a week. It's called the PDH Pals. So if you care about any weird stuff that I like, then you should check them out too. It's really fun.
All right. So one more time, I'll say shout out to those Pauper Commander folks. Shout out to Frogslicer. Thank you for coming on. A shout out to all my certified burn boys and girls and other down in Please Burn World. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. But with that, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a lovely day.
Thanks, guys.